If I could ask the ICER staff to try to reach Ann Raldo and just make sure that she comes back, because we will want her to hear the discussion before the vote's taken. But we've got everybody else. So yes, again, welcome back, and we can go ahead and put up the first voting question, and then we'll start to talk about it. Okay, first, the patient population for all the voting questions, pardon me, is adolescents and adults with severe sickle cell disease who do not have access to or cannot receive hematopoietic stem cell transplantation from a matched sibling or haploidentical donor. Again, this is taken largely from the clinical trial eligibility, and therefore defines the population for which we have the direct evidence. And we will come back to talk about some elements of this when we do talk about translating it into insurance coverage. But that's the patient population. And the first voting question is the evidence adequate? The current evidence, is the current evidence adequate to demonstrate that the net health benefit of exa-cel is superior to that provided by standard of care? And again, you know now the list of things that are considered to be standard of care, even though many patients with sickle cell disease do not receive or have appropriate access to these. Okay, so don't start voting yet, but if you're having any issues with the voting software, please also alert the ICER staff. But let's go ahead and take the slide down and talk about this question. So the first question is about exa-cel. And Francesca, if I can ask you from the ICER team's perspective again, to briefly summarize the key data, refer, if you will, to the evidence summary. That's just the key tables that are taken out of the ICER report so that the CTAF panel can get oriented onto the key data, and then we'll take the discussion from there.
So the attention to tables 5 and 6 in the evidence packet. Table 5 are the results, key trial results for lovo-cel, and table 6 is that of exa-cel. And then the two tables after that, 7 and 8, are about harms.
Oops, Francesca, we're getting some kind of garbling over your voice. I'm not sure if there's paper.
Maybe I'm flipping papers because I'm looking at, maybe I'm flipping papers myself. Is that better?
Yes, yes, it is.
Sounds good. So tables 5 and 6 for key trial outcomes, tables 7 and 8 for harms. And to briefly summarize, in the trials of both lovo-cel and exa-cel, nearly 94% and 96% of participants had absence of severe VOCs or VOEs during the period of observable follow-up, noting that it's a small sample and not all participants are yet observable for the key trial endpoints. Also benefits to hospitalization, quality of life, and that, again, that severe VOCs, VOEs. All regarding harms, all participants experienced adverse event. 100% in both trials had some sort of adverse event in undergoing the therapy, including both the myeloablative chemo plus the intervention itself. And serious adverse events were also common in 40% of the exa-cel participants and 50% of the lovo-cel participants. There were deaths in both trials. None were directly attributable to the gene therapy itself, but the question has been raised about kind of the whole package, the risks of the chemo, et cetera, and weighing that against the risks of sickle cell disease itself, and also thinking about myeloablative chemo and stem cell transplant. So, and again, to refresh about the evidence ratings, lovo-cel is a B+ for us and exa-cel a C++, reflecting uncertainty about long-term durability, safety, and first-in-kind and different mechanism with CRISPR therapy.
Okay, so actually, let me ask one question myself first while you CTAF panel members, please kind of put back on your thinking caps, because we've talked about some of this already, but I wanted to ask about the 16 out of 17. So what do we know about patient 17? Why does this treatment not work if you will, or not work well enough in some patients. Can a clinical expert guide us through the thinking on, I don't know, honestly, if we really have any information specifically from the clinical trials about that patient, but methodologically, what would explain the failure of the gene therapy to achieve the goal of eliminating VOCs? Pat or Cece?
Sickle cell pain is incredibly complex, and vaso-occlusive pain from sickled red blood cells blocking blood vessels and flow of oxygen is sort of the traditional pathophysiology we think about, but many patients experience pain that's caused by something else, or it might not be sickle cell related, and it's hard to tell. I don't know the details of that one patient specifically, but if it's really just about reducing pain, my suspicion is that it's sort of pain that the sort of scientific effect of reducing the amount of sickled cells probably worked, but the end clinical result of pain may not have been met because pain is complex.
Okay. Cece, anything you'd like to add or not?
I think it's hard to tell without knowing specifically more information around that patient. Like, did they engraft properly? What the effects were.
Yeah, I mean, again, we're still the entire world is still relatively early in the clinical experience with any kind of gene therapies. And obviously, we're talking about exa-cel, which would be the first CRISPR. But, we've already seen at least a couple of gene therapies have, in the teens, numbers of patients. And, the results might be 14 out of 15 or what have you. And at least anecdotally, and I'm talking about certain gene therapies, for instance, for spinal muscular atrophy, anecdotally, the story is that those percents are fairly unsteady when you start to see it in the real world, in terms of some of them being lower in some people's estimation. So I'm not sure how much true epidemiology we have, but I was just, again, curious about what could explain 16 out of 17. Let me hand it over now to the CTAF panel members who you guys have your own questions or comments as we start to wade through this. Rita, please go ahead.
Thanks. I just wanted to ask if the experts would comment on standard of care. I understand it's underutilized, but when it is utilized, could you comment on the outcomes?
Yeah, certainly when I think of our standard of care, most well-known drug, I think about hydroxyurea, which is successful in increasing hemoglobin F. As you all know, it's a daily medication that we titrate to the maximum tolerated dose based on neutropenia, thrombocytopenia. And when used properly, it is effective in reducing longer-term sequelae of sickle cell disease. Dr. McGann alluded to this a little bit earlier. Some of the newer therapies, CRIS, which is a P-selectin inhibitor that we may not really use that much anymore. Oxbryta, which irreversibly binds hemoglobin to prevent sickling, has good effect. And then L-glutamine, which I don't think is used pretty often in clinical practice either. And then if there are untoward complications like stroke, our kind of number one ace in the hole is exchange transfusion, which one of our patients mentioned that they had been on, which is a significant clinical burden. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Joy?
Yeah, I have sort of a two-part question for the clinical experts. And this is about exa-cel right now, since that's the therapy we're voting on at the moment. So the first part is do you feel ready, if this is approved based on the evidence that we have at this point, to offer this to your patients? And if you do, this is the second part, how do you view the challenges and barriers to accessing this therapy successfully versus the challenges and barriers of accessing current standard of care? And sort of what, I asked this in a different meeting, but what proportion of your patients do you think would actually be eligible for / able to access this therapy?
You mean from a clinical perspective or an insurance, everything else perspective, Joy? Because I want to hold some of that for the policy roundtable.
Well, I'm just sticking with clinical right now. I mean, I think from what I recall, it's just hard. I mean, it's hard to get standard of care. And so, you know, if you're ready to offer this to your patients, would it be harder? How much harder? How do you see that affecting which patients might be able to access it? Leaving insurance aside for the moment.
That's like a multiple part question that's
Yes.
quite complex. Yes, I'm ready. I think as Dr. Callahan mentioned, we have very limited treatment options. Hydroxyurea is a great treatment, but many patients have tried it and it doesn't work. And it's hard to get adequate doses in older patients, especially, and patients need something. And this data is quite convincing. So yes, I'm ready. Yes, the patients are ready. I think access, and when we talk about access to things like hydroxyurea and standard of care, it's really less so about my personal patients or Dr. Callahan's personal patients, but as a country, sickle cell patients don't have access to sickle cell specialists. I'm at a meeting now of the National Alliance of Sickle Cell Centers, where we're trying to improve the number of sickle cell providers and centers so we can provide the standard of care. And then for those who don't benefit from it, of which there'll be some, provide the advanced therapies like curative therapies we're describing. How many is a really challenging question. It's going to depend on the labeling, and I think we'll maybe talk about that at some point later. But you know, the studies included 12 to 40-year-olds or so, 12 to 30, 16 to 30. There were different ranges in that general sort of range. And there's some exclusion criteria. You couldn't have stroke, you couldn't have chronic pain, and so it's going to depend on how it's labeled. But so it's not going to be 100% of our patients. It's not even going to be 50% of our patients. I think of those that are eligible, it'll probably be closer to a quarter, maybe, just sort of very much off the top of my head. And then those that will agree to do it will be lower, especially from the get-go. But I think this is all speculation for sure.
Thanks. CC, anything more? All right. Let me go through the next couple questions then. Rena?
Yeah, actually, my question is a little bit related to the last one, and it's about why, to the clinical experts, why were the trials so small in terms of number? Was this trial design? Was this the eligibility criteria? Was it patient interest? You know, is that something that was related to patient availability at these particular centers? I'm just wondering why it was kept so small.
So I want to add a caveat that I didn't design the trial and not like any of the companies that executed it. But when we think about the age range, adult age range, and then some of the inclusion and exclusion criteria, which I again think we'll talk a bit about more later as well, as it regards Karnofsky score, organ function, genotype, those things all play a role into the patient eligibility. Then also, you know, there is kind of a significant hump in kind of getting these particular trials up and available at certain centers. So I think access was a little bit confounded in that way as well. And then, you know, I think we have all talked about larger context of clinical trial enrollment for historically marginalized populations, which I think is also a big factor that contributed to the numbers as well.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Do you think that will predict a difficulty with patient, you know, uptake after approval?
I think that if it's approved, it'll be wider access. It won't be in the scope of a trial, which can be a little bit more restrictive. I do think that patient interest is there, and patient willingness to participate once they're eligible will be really impacted by the relationship that we have with our patients and who we recommend to. But outside of the trial space, I think actually access will be greater. And so I hope that it'll be able to be used a bit more.
Thanks.
Thank you. Paul?
Rena, and actually follow up to your question, I have a similar thought, and I saw in the Cantor New England Journal paper, they had 35 patients, and they said that would give them 99% power, having 35 patients to find significant reduction in 40% of patients. However, in their clinicaltrials.gov registration, they said they'd include 50 patients. So I'm in a similar, that was the same thing I was wondering. But my main question at this point was, it seemed for that, for the LOVA group, that the data is it true that data is only up through 2021 or 20, and is the FDA and others going to have, say, significantly more patients on which to review this? I realize that, we won't be able, I'm not sure that's going to change anyone's rating right now. I'm just curious how much more data is out there to be reported.
Let me let the team respond to that, but I just want to remind folks that we're voting on XSL first, and then we'll come to Lovo-cel as the next vote. So Francesca or...
Sorry, that was my fault. Because I summarized both interventions, but regarding both of the trials. So XSL has, for us, the least amount of data of the two therapies right now. They both have mid-30s number of patients. And XSL, we have that primary outcome of severe VOE, VOC in 17 patients. So another 50% of the patients will need to be observed. And then there's more data with Lovo-cel. So we have data on 31 of the 36 people in that group C cohort. They did, and just as a point of clarification, enroll 45 patients in total if you include all the... It's a single trial with 3 different cohorts, and there were some manufacturing changes. But yeah, so there is more data to come, more so on the XSL side.
Okay. I think we should go ahead and move to a vote on this. We've got a lot of votes to take, and we have 1 hour, so I have to manage the time, but I'm not seeing any other hands. So let's go back. And again, now you can go ahead and enter your vote. Is the current evidence adequate to demonstrate that the net health benefit of XSL is superior to that provided by standard of care? And we should have 14 voting members if Anne has joined us. Okay, there we go. So we can show the results. Okay, so I'm not going to quickly do the back of the envelope math on that, but yes is 93% and no is 7%. I'm guessing that's 1 no and 13 yes. Okay, let's go to the next question. Is the evidence adequate to demonstrate that the net health benefit of Lovo-cel is superior to that provided by standard of care? And again, I know, Francesca, you mentioned where the tables are with the benefits and the harms data, but again, just summarize the distinctive data for Lovo-cel.
Sure. And so table 5 and table 7 are specific to Lovo-cel. Again, 30 of 31 participants who were observable and reported out in the Lovo-cel trial were free of severe events during the follow-up period. However, adverse events were common. 100% of people had adverse events in Lovo-cel. There were deaths observed in the trials as well as malignancies. So two malignancies that were not deemed due to oncogenic insertion. And there appears to be good hematologic response also sustained over the observable period. And by that, I'm talking about elevated hemoglobin, proportion of hemoglobin that is not sickled hemoglobin, markers of hemolysis.
Okay, we may have covered some of the more specific and broader questions that you guys might have about the evidence. About anything you want to ask or make comment on in your vote on this one? Bob.
Francesca, if you wouldn't mind just kind of flesh out a little bit the 3 different groups in that trial. And I've heard you say that there was manufacturing change and stuff, but there's a 7 and a 2 and a 36, and 36 is what we're most interested in here.
That's right. So that was also those were the trials too that were when they were evaluating with beta thalassemia, and those were the phase 1 trials, and there was a lot of like tweaking and refinement. And when we did the beta thalassemia report, we saw the same thing. And so the kind of the final product that will be FDA approved is in that 36 cohort. And so that's why we evaluated that. But I think that the other groups are definitely relevant for the safety aspects, more so than the efficacy, I would say. And so we did report those out in the adverse events, but we did not report them out in the efficacy data.
Okay, thanks. I'd also, Steve, just to me, I think I'd be remiss for not pointing out that this one is labeled a phase 1/2, the other one's labeled a phase 1/2/3. Things that I was told not very many years ago couldn't possibly happen, you know, like so as an RCT true believer, I've got that heartburn, but you know, this seems to be the world that we're into right now.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have too much time to talk about it, but I'm happy to entertain further discussion about your sense of the certainty of the data lacking randomization. I would note that it can be hard to randomize patients when bone marrow transplant is a part of the therapy.
I'm absolutely, I would love to hear somebody try and describe a real RCT that we can do in this particular area, ethically anyway, of course.
I'm not
Clinical
sure that
experts. Oh, sorry, Francesca.
all I would
go
say is
ahead.
that I'm not sure that it's needed. You know, we all grow up learning that RCT is the gold standard, and so that gets like heavily ingrained. But when we think about the reason we do a randomized controlled trial, it's such that you deal with confounding, like all the things that can be associated with your, you know, intervention exposure and the outcomes. And in a case like this, where as long as we don't think there's like time varying things that are messing with the outcomes, a self-controlled design, I think, can be appropriate. And
yeah, that's part of why I brought it up. That's part of why I brought it up, Francesca. I really did appreciate your comment earlier.
Yeah.
The thing that we're dealing with here doesn't fit real well with that, and we eliminate a lot of the confounding issues.
There would be those who would argue the opposite. I'm not going to, we don't have time to get into another deep philosophical discussion, but just to put on the table, regression to the mean is a real thing, especially, but not even just for quote unquote subjective outcomes. So even if we're using self-controls, we just have to be at least somewhat alert. But I think, again, we've had some of the discussion around how all of the if you will, surrogate outcomes in terms of hemoglobin changes and everything else were obviously highly suggestive of a real effect. But there's always going to be some concern. Okay, I hope I haven't triggered too much. We want to move relatively quickly, but Joy and then Ralph. Joy? Oops, you're on mute, sorry.
I guess I would, I agree pretty strongly that this is a case where randomization may not give us that much more information in addition to the incredible complexity of trying to pull it off. But what worries me more, I think, is the small number and the relatively short time period. And this is for both. I mean, I wouldn't differentiate between the two gene therapies on this. It's just that I'm sure there are things we do not yet know about these therapies. And is it worth it to wait to try to learn those things in an experimental setting or a trial setting? That's, probably it isn't, given the state of how terrible this disease is and how little there is out there to offer patients. But it is possible that something really bad could be lurking. That's a more rare side effect that we just haven't seen yet because of the small numbers.
Good, Ralph?
Yeah, just a comment. Again, ideally, you'd want to wait 15 years, but this is a terrible disease, and the therapy seems pretty impressive in terms of decreasing crises and vascular occlusive events. I will point out, I don't think it was Francesca formally mentioned it, but again, the therapy that we're now voting on was given a B+ rating. The therapy that we previously voted on was given a C++ rating. And this therapy has been around longer And so we have a little more confidence, whatever you can throw some salt on that related to the issue of malignancies. So that's my comment.
Okay, great. Thank you. Let's go ahead and take a vote on lovo-cel. Is the current evidence adequate to demonstrate that the net health benefit of lovo-cel is superior to that provided by standard of care? All right, you can show the results. Look at that. I guess my reverse math was correct. All right, and thank you for the absolute version. 13 yes and 1 no. All right, let's go ahead now. We're going to shift to an important part. Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize. There is one more question here, and it's about whether the current evidence, we can go back, sorry, to the voting question. The next one, here we go. I forgot this, sorry, forgot this question was coming. But now that we've voted on each independently, we're going to ask the question of whether the current evidence is adequate to demonstrate. I'm not sure why it keeps showing us votes. Okay, here we go. Given the currently available evidence, is it adequate to distinguish the net health benefit between exa-cel and lovo-cel? And I think what's happening is that as people vote, it's somehow capturing it all at once. But hopefully we can hold off on any further votes. Let's have a brief discussion. Francesca, again, if you can, please just, I think we know, but just remind us what the ICER rating was and the reason.
The ICER rating was an I, insufficient evidence. There are no direct comparisons and differences in the reporting of trial outcomes and some other differences in the trials led us to not be able to do an indirect comparison between the two therapies.
Okay. Any questions from CTAF? Let's go ahead and vote. Okay, so given the currently available evidence, is it adequate to distinguish the net health benefits between the two treatments? All right, we can show the results now. 14 no, 0 yes. Okay, so with that sorted, now let's talk about important potential other benefits and contextual issues that can frame the view often of the clinical information. And I will comment again that some of these issues are absolutely germane to some of the concerns that that the representative from Sickle raised about what can be quantified or what should be quantified. And again, we have quite a broad range in a sense within the cost effectiveness perspective to accommodate discussion and integration of some of these additional considerations. So what we're going to talk about in terms of the votes are around making judgments of the overall long-term value for money, which for many people is the kind of ultimate value vote. What is the relative priority that should be given to any effective treatment for sickle cell disease on the basis of the following contextual considerations? Okay, so any effective treatment, either of these obviously, and the first voting question is, so first off, what's the relative priority based on the acuity of the need for treatment of individual patients based on their short-term risk of death or progression to permanent disability? So this is one slice, if you will, of the general term called severity. And so we need to kind of consider what's the relative priority for this. Now, it feels like we've heard a fair amount about the course of sickle cell disease, but Jimmy and Elle, if you will, and certainly the clinical experts, this is a vote that's going to be asking about whether there's a special priority that we wish to give this on the basis of the acuity of the need for patients, as if, you know, for some cases we want to say they're near the end of life, they got 6 months left. Maybe we should give a little bit of extra credit to the health gains within that short time span left. So it's meant to capture that kind of situation. So sickle cell isn't quite that kind of rapidly fatal condition. It obviously shortens lifespans and has a great burden over the long haul, but there's a question here about acuity of need. So if anybody wants to comment or if CTAF wants to ask a question, but we may be able to vote relatively quickly on this one. Alex.
Would patients at high risk of death within, say, the prognosis of 6 months likely be eligible to receive this treatment or these treatments?
I'm going to let the clinical experts weigh in on that.
No, there's a lot of complications of sickle cell disease that are, all the complications really are irreversible. And the idea would be to do this before they occur. So those patients who are already have end organ damage that's life-threatening are probably not going to be eligible and wouldn't be good candidates for this.
Okay, thanks, Paul.
Yeah, I just maybe make it clear that we're not judging how important it is to reduce the disability, but rather whether that particular, given everything else, that's all the other benefits, should that acute impact on disability be weighed compared to all the other issues we're considering and their relative benefit. At least that's how I'm interpreting it.
That's correct. And the CTAF panel knows that the next question coming is about the magnitude of the lifetime impact of this condition. So this isn't the only way we're talking about whether this is a severe or serious condition at all. Jeff?
So, quick question, not sure it belongs here, but I've got to get it out somewhere, which is they excluded patients with stroke, and stroke is something that obviously could be an acute change, but obviously if somebody just had a stroke, they're not going to get a bone marrow transplant. What was the rationale for excluding patients with previous stroke? Is that likely to be something moving forward? We can wait and discuss this later, but I was just curious because it kind of made me think about it when we're talking about acuity. There's a few things more acute than a stroke.
Sure. Clinical experts, I'm not sure anybody on our team knows why that was a specific exclusion criterion. Do you guys have an idea?
I would presume that it's related to like clinical stability, but it's my expectation that a patient who has had a stroke, maybe if there's been some time between, that I'll be able to send them for gene therapy. That would be one of my considerations in thinking about who I want to refer. So to prevent secondary stroke, because right now all we have for secondary stroke prevention is red cell exchange.
I think this is maybe something we'll talk about later too, but I think that the clinical trials had relatively narrow inclusion-exclusion criteria that eliminate some patients like those with stroke or at risk of stroke who would otherwise benefit from this. My suspicion is just to keep the clinical trials sort of cleaner so that once you have a stroke, your risk of second stroke is very high. And I think the trials didn't want that, but these patients need this therapy, and it's going to be really problematic if the indication or the payers won't pay because that wasn't included in the clinical trial.
Stay tuned. We'll come back to that for sure. Okay, let's go ahead and vote on this question, please. All right, so ranging from very low priority to very high priority to be given to any effective treatment for sickle cell disease based on the acuity of need for the treatment of individual patients, based on their short-term risk of risk of death or progression to permanent disability. Waiting for one more vote. There we go. Okay, high five, you can see the numbers there. Actually drops off at the bottom of my screen for some reason, but maybe I can make that bigger. Nope, I still can't see the very low priority vote. Was it 1 or 0? Can anybody else say? I think it's just the way I have it.
0.
Was it? Okay, I think it's the way I have.
0. You can see if you go into Slido.
Yeah, I think I can have to change the orientation here. Okay, let's go to the next one, which is same setup about relative priority of treatment based this time on the magnitude of the lifetime impact on individual patients of the condition being treated, sickle cell disease in this case. And I know that we had wonderful public comment. Tisha and others obviously gave eloquent voice to the lifetime impact of this condition. Jimmy or Elle, anything else you'd like to add? We will talk about caregivers next, but just anything else you'd like to add about the magnitude of the impact of this on patients' lives?
The impact is it's sometimes it's even hard to put in words. And just to piggyback off of what you guys discussed, and just to show you how acute this disease can be in regards, specifically in regards to the lack of data. I participated in a clinical trial, CRISPR-based, 3 years ago, and the 3 years I've had to live now, if I die tomorrow, has been worth it. That's how change my life has become because of a clinical trial of this magnitude, and what my life was like before, having CRISPR in it or having CRISPR change it. 2 failed suicide attempts that I'm guessing, looking back in hindsight, one was probably a cry for help. I never got that help, by the way, which we should talk more about that. The mental side of things, I feel like that is still being ignored till this day. Definitely there's work that's going on, but it's still not enough. It's still nearly not enough pre and post transplant. So for me, obviously I'm a patient, so my opinion completely differs from you guys as medical experts and looking at the grand scheme of things. But for me, these 3 years have been magical, and like I said, if I die tomorrow, it's been worth it. So the acuity to me, that subject is extremely very high. And if I had the power to, this, I would approve it ASAP.
Understood. And don't sell yourself short. You've got plenty of breadth to your view here, as well as specific experience. Appreciate that. I also thought I would just comment, it's not perhaps that germane to the vote, but you mentioned mental health again. I hope we can come back to that in other ways. But we really hope that companies will do a better job of incorporating measures in their studies of things that matter to patients. Again, the sick cells representative mentioned this, but because there was no data on mental health effects of the treatment, we decided not to just put a 0 into the economic model. We actually gave a pretty high number, that 0.05, if you might remember it. But it is a shame that we don't have real data to work with based on what the companies choose to include in their clinical trials. So I hope that one of the recommendations ultimately out of our work can be to do a better job of capturing those data so that everybody can have a more firm basis on which to make a quantitative estimate, because it's absolutely critical, as you just made clear again. All right. Elle, were you? Yes.
Yeah, yes. I wanted to share that as a parent of a child with sickle cell disease, one thing that we think of the moment we find out our child is diagnosed with sickle cell is a way to cure them. It is something that is in the back of our minds every day. And when you are a parent of a child with sickle cell disease, every day you live with some aspect of fear because sickle cell is so unpredictable. And when you are presented with a curative therapy, with gene therapy, you find out that for many of our loved ones, they don't have access to it. I think of my own child who doesn't have enough vaso-occlusive crisis, but what I've learned is that sickle cell disease is much more than just pain crisis. You can have so many other comorbidities that really affect a person's quality of life. So when you are given an opportunity to find some idea of a cure, I think for me, a cure, when I first heard of it, it was completely different than what I understand gene therapy to be now. But I accept the value in what gene therapy offers because it definitely gives a better quality of life to patients, not just helping them live longer, but healthier lives. So we want our loved ones to be able to do everything else that other people can do. And that health equity piece is huge. So I think that gene therapy is a blessing in many ways, a blessing that many of us as caregivers have always dreamed of.
Thank you very much. All right, please let's put up the voting question again. And the vote on this one is relative priority very low to very high. And this time the basis of the vote is the magnitude of the lifetime impact on individual patients of the condition being treated, sickle cell disease. Please go ahead and vote. Oh, we already have all our votes. Okay, very high 13 and high 1. All right, great. Let's move to the next voting question. Okay, so now we're talking about, exa-cel and lovo-cel, since we haven't been able to differentiate their relative effects at this stage versus standard of care. We want to talk about other ways to think about the benefits they might have that might not be fully captured. They might be largely captured even, but maybe not fully captured by the cost effectiveness or the clinical information. So let's look at the first voting question within this set. And here again, we've talked about what we can measure with health and the other things we can try to add in as a, if you will, a kind of factor to accommodate mental health improvements, even though we don't have data. But we want to ask here about these treatments and their relative effect on patients' ability to achieve their major life goals related to education, work, or family life. So again, we've had a wonderful discussion and commentary on the impact of sickle cell. But these treatments, and Jimmy, feel free to jump in again since you had one of them, but again, their ability to affect patients' broader life kind of trajectory, plans for college, plans for work, plans for families, anything else you'd like to add to the panel's understanding? Or clinical experts? Jimmy?
It completely rapids it. It's like a lighter fuel. Everything you weren't able to do without the therapy, all of a sudden you're able to do it. Before my gene therapy specifically, I was known as someone that was flaky. Couldn't attend meetings. Obviously, most of the people career-wise didn't know what I was going to. At one point, I actually just became unemployable, and like my friend Joe became my own business owner. And it was many years of struggling, and post-transplant, having gene therapy after going through the therapy, things are completely different. Now you have boundless amounts of energy that you didn't have before. Obviously, that comes with its own problems as well. Just being able to do all these things out of nowhere that you once dreamed of, and all of a sudden, almost kind of overnight, you can do them now. So the therapy definitely helps. We're going to talk more about it on the roundtable with the big C word, if this is a cure or not, or how to present it to the public, because we're not supposed to use that word cure, because specifically in my therapy, it's officially not a cure, but it feels like it. It definitely changes your life, where you're able to go out and achieve or try to achieve those things that you've always wanted to, while you were in the throes of the disease.
Great, thank you. Okay, I think let's go ahead and take a vote on that one. So these therapies affect everything from major negative effect to major positive effect versus standard of care on patients' broader ability to achieve their major life goals. Just waiting for one vote. There we go, thank you. Okay, major positive effect, 14 out of 14. All right, the next voting question. L, your time has come. Caregivers, the effect of these kinds of treatments as we know them today versus standard of care on caregivers' quality of life and or their ability to achieve their major life goals related to their education, work, or family life. Jeannie Cottrell, Ms. Cottrell, she was very eloquent. I would love to hear, Elle, anything else you'd like to say to what you've already shared with us. about the impact that you see, maybe not even just personally, but other families? Have you seen the broader effect that these treatments, in a sense, could have on the caregiver's experience?
Yes. So I wanted to just begin by saying when my daughter was diagnosed with sickle cell disease, I was working for a corporate company and I left my job because it didn't offer me the flexibility that I needed. And like Jimmy and others, I had to start my own business because I felt like it was the only way for me to get the flexibility I needed to take care of my daughter. Healthcare is very expensive, so I couldn't just take off of work and not work. I had to find a way to have income. And given a treatment like gene therapy, it gives families back their lives. For caregivers, often we have dreams, we've gone to school, we've gotten our education, and there are things that we still want to do, but sickle cell disease not only robs the patient, it not only removes many of our dreams for our children, but our dreams for ourselves as well. And given an opportunity to see our kids live a better life and see our loved ones live a better quality of life, we are able to also fulfill our dreams again and go back into some different types of work that we may have gone to school for, or things that really drive our passions. And I think that given that opportunity, sickle cell disease is life-changing for a person's family, not just the patient itself, other siblings as well. So it really impacts the entire household. So when you think about this treatment, it is a way for the family to gain a sense of normalcy. And so I think that really makes a big difference. And I'm looking forward to see what happens, what the outcome holds in the future.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. All right. I feel like we can vote on this one also now. Why don't we go ahead and put the question back up? From major negative effect to major positive effect, what is the relative effect of the new treatments on caregivers' quality of life and or their ability to achieve major life goals? Okay, 14. Let's see the results. 12 and 2. All right. We're capturing important things here. We've got 2 more questions to go in this section. The first is about these 2 treatments versus standard of care, their relative effect on patients' ability to manage and sustain treatment given the complexity of the regimen. Let me just explain this briefly. So sometimes, again, people want to think about giving extra credit or extra value to a treatment that is simpler to take because it means that patients and their families it might just be easier in the real world for them to be on the treatment over either on the long term, or in this case, it would be a short term. But we want to think about whether, from a clinical perspective here, we're likely to see major benefits because patients and families will find it easier compared to standard of care. Clinical experts, I think I'd like to start with you here. As you see your whole, patient population that you care for, talk about how having a relatively concentrated treatment like this, it's not like one time you have to go through the bone marrow transplant, all that. So it's not like it's one day you're in and out. But how do you weigh that versus the issues that patients face around adherence over the longer term? Cece, go ahead.
All right, I'll go.
Happy to go. I know Pat has more experience with adherence, especially around hydroxyurea than I do. But I think, we talked a lot about the impact of curing a disease. I think if we're talking strictly about the daily medication versus a brief, very intense time, I would have everybody think about if you've ever been in a course of antibiotics for 2 weeks and how many doses did you miss? And imagine if you had to do that for a lifetime, right? It can be challenging. So when it comes to daily adherence, it's a bit of a challenge. But for something like gene therapy, I'm always going to try hydroxyurea first. I think it's just the best thing to do to start with. But certainly having something that is brief, will optimize not just the daily chance of complications, but also the moving forward beyond that and disease consequence prevention.
Thanks. Pat, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot of patients who do really well on hydroxyurea, but some of them also feel very burdened day to day for having a chronic condition and having to take their medicine. And there are some patients I know who have interest in curative therapy, even though on the surface they might be well. They wouldn't, again, meet the criteria for the clinical trial because they're not in the hospital all the time, but they have a chronic condition that can be life-threatening and they want to be unburdened from that. So I think regardless of what kind of therapies we have, having this as an option, again, really for anyone with sickle cell disease who has interest in it, will be important. And I think it's a serious condition for all patients, and everyone with sickle cell disease, or most people with sickle cell disease, will die from some complication of sickle cell disease, acute or chronic, and their life will be shortened no matter what we do right now. And so I think having the opportunity to unburden them from that day-to-day adherence would be a good thing.
Okay, great. Thanks. Lisa.
Yeah, and just to clarify for myself, and like in terms of the burden and complexity of this regimen, they get the transplant while they're in the hospital, so that's all managed. But after that, there's no medications at all, and compared to other medications, correct? So there's really nothing for them to take and worry about after the initial transplant. And I was wondering if you could also compare that to donor-related transplant and what the burden of that therapy is.
Yeah, so theoretically, if it works well, there will be nothing required in the long term. Bone marrow transplant is different in that you have to often be on immunosuppression for long periods of time, or indefinitely even, to prevent your body from rejecting the graft that is not yours. And so that's the benefit of an autologous, or your own stem cells that are collected. So there's some degree of adherence that's required long term for people with transplant. And if gene therapy goes well, they should be unburdened from having to take anything directly related to their sickle cell disease.
So there's not much to manage or sustain at all, really.
No, I mean, whatever has happened prior to the gene therapy will need to be continued to manage. So there might be some degree of renal damage or some chronic pain or whatever it might be. So those things should not get worse, but may need to be managed. But theoretically, all the rest should be cleared up with no further sequelae.
And that's not the burden of this treatment. That's the burden of other treatments, but not for this treatment that we're looking at.
Okay, great. Joy.
Yeah. So just to try to sort of clarify, it seems like with the it's very front loaded. The burden is very front loaded. So at the beginning of the treatment, in order to go through the process, the gene therapy process, it's a very intense experience with a lot of adverse effects. 100% of people had adverse effects, right? But maybe that lasts, I don't know, a couple months. And then assuming it works, that's it, except for whatever you're carrying with you from prior chronic problems that persist, but no more acute problems. So that's sort of in contrast with something like hydroxyurea, where it can control a lot of the problems, but it requires ongoing therapy, and some people don't tolerate it so well. So is that an accurate sort of assessment of the comparison?
Exactly, yep.
Yeah, it almost seems like a patient preference kind of thing.
We'll get to that too. All right, we're starting to run down and out of time. We have one last important question to address, but Ralph, if you have a quick question or comment.
Just a comment, patients that require repeated transfusions would not require transfusions. That's quite a burden.
Okay, great. Let's go ahead and vote on that question then. This is the relative effects of these treatments versus standard of care on patients' ability to manage and sustain their treatment given the complexity of the regimen, from major negative to major positive effect. There we go. Okay, 10 and 4, 10 major positive, 4 minor positive. Okay, last but not least, because it leads into a lot of what we'll be talking about at the top of the policy roundtable. But this is our standing question for all treatments on whether these treatments versus standard of care offer benefits that would help society address or meet its goal of reducing health inequities. We frame this question very broadly because it could be inequities around rural versus urban access or different kinds. And obviously here, the obvious framework is racial and ethnic disparities over time. I'd love to have a few comments from, again, patients and or clinical experts. We can think about, I think about this effect either at the individual patient level. What will the effect on them be of their experience with racism and inequities of other kinds? And we can think about it at the very broad societal level. Do these treatments offer a chance for society in some way to address those disparities? Any ways that you feel that we should view this as an element of how we judge the value of these treatments?
I want to let the patient experts go first.
I think that's a tough one for me. I doubt, and obviously I have no experience in racial studies or anything, but I think that's just more of a symptom, well, unless I'm not getting the question right. I don't think gene therapies will, no matter what the access to it, the cure, that specific therapy, I think we're just going, the way America is set up, I don't think we can cure racism specifically with, the patients are still going to go through, patients of color are still, it's still going to be, because I think our healthcare system it's actually the system that's not equal, so if we don't fix the inequality in our system, no matter what therapies are there, patients of color are still going to suffer.
Just so you know, that is literally the first topic of conversation when we come back to the policy roundtable, which is what do each of the stakeholders or major participants in the health system have to do to address those underlying features that have led to these disparities, these inequities. Cece, you want to come in now?
I think Jimmy really highlighted that it's racism, not race, that has caused the inequities. I think our society's racism does inform our policies, that informs our environments, that can inform our diagnosis, treatment, ultimately outcomes in disease. I think particularly in sickle cell disease, there's a dearth of treatment options, which I think is a downstream consequence of racism within healthcare systems. And so I'm really enthusiastic about thinking about how we can bring better access to patients for new and novel therapies for a disease that we've known about, for, over a century at this point. So Jimmy's absolutely right. One thing won't cure racism. I think it'll be multiple and many things, all of which will make a greater impact. And I think that offering such an innovative, scientifically forward option for therapy is one small step.
Thank you. Jeff?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, I'm not sure who I'm asking it of, but what we heard is that people get undertreated for pain, for example, and that there's, each acute event, there's a risk of, not getting appropriate treatment. And I'm wondering, given that we have to answer this question, I'm wondering if, given the fact that it seems like all this goes away, would there be a, significant benefit on the disparity? Because you obviously, if you face a disparity each time you get treated, and you have a treatment that eliminates the need for future treatments, I'm wondering if it wouldn't have a positive effect. So I'm curious about that. The other thing is, people don't always have insurance coverage. We know that people roll in and out of coverage. And if you need to get transfusions, which are not cheap, and you need to stay on hydroxyurea and all the monitoring, if you have an opportunity when you happen to be able to provide this, would that, give you a long-term benefit by being able to capture that effective treatment at the time when you happen to be able to do it?
Well, I know that you were not sure to whom you were posing your question, but I'll answer by saying yes. I think you're absolutely right with those assumptions. I also wanted to state that Kim Gregory, who might have wanted to comment, let me know that her mic's not working. So I think that's the case. So anyway, you can try to get through to us via chat or otherwise, but I hope your mic comes back on. David?
So I was just going to comment. I've been a primary care doctor for 35 years, working in ERs and urgent cares and primary care settings. And people sometimes talk about, racism. The place I've most seen it is around the treatment of pain in Black patients, and particularly in Black patients with sickle cell disease, just over and over again over the years. And having a treatment that might get rid of that pain, as Jeff was just talking about, actually does seem like something that, in a weird way, I mean, Jimmy's of course right, it does nothing about the underlying racism in the system, but at least it causes people not being left in pain because they're Black and have sickle cell disease. And we heard from a mother and a parent this morning describing being unable to protect her child from being undertreated for pain, which I take care of adults. I hadn't really thought much about yet that next level of undertreatment, not just, my patients being undertreated for pain, but children with parents standing by being undertreated for pain. So at least from my point of view, this seems like a pretty big deal for not eliminating racism as Jimmy was hoping, but maybe reducing the inequities.
All right, let's vote on that question. Thank you for all the comments. So these treatments versus standard of care, their effect on society's goal of reducing health inequities from major negative to major positive. Okay, if somebody's having a hard time getting into the system, let us know. There we go. Okay, good. Okay, major positive to minor positive, 10 and 4. All right, this is the topic that we will return to. Thank you very much. And this is the exact topic we'll return to talk about different aspects of it. We'll have a lot to cover in an hour and a half. So we are still going to try to start right back at 4:15, give everybody a quick 6 minutes, 1:15 Pacific. So we'll see you at 15 past the hour, and we'll have our full policy roundtable involved at that point. So see you at 15 past the hour.